It's Thursday, February 16th, 2023. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies at the University of Georgia. I'm in Savannah, Georgia, with former State Representative Jim Pannell. Mr. Pannell is a partner in the law firm of Gray, Pannell, and Woodward. Born in Atlanta and grew up in Chatsworth, he earned a BBA in economics as well as his JD from the University of Georgia. During the early 1970s, Mr. Pannell served on the staffs of Richard B. Russell Jr. and David Gambrell in Washington, D.C. He represented the Savannah area in the Georgia House of Representatives from 1985 until 1990. During that time, he served on the Ways and Means, Judiciary, Natural Resources, and Health and Ecology committees. He ran unsuccessfully for Lieutenant Governor of Georgia in 1990. He remains active in the Savannah and State Bar Associations, as well as the Richard B. Russell Foundation, something near and dear to both our hearts. Jim, thank you so much for hosting us here in Savannah. And just a note that because we're in Savannah, there is some tree service going on outside, so we hope that it's not too much of a hindrance to your viewing pleasure. So, we talked about this a little bit before when we talked about your time on the Senate staffs, but you grew up in Northwest Georgia, not Savannah, is that right?
Correct. My family is from Chatsworth, Murray County, and have been for, both my parents were born in Murray County. We moved to Atlanta when my father was appointed to the Georgia Court of Appeals in 1963. I was a sophomore in high school, but we've always maintained that connection and have property up there, and that's home, so to speak.
Which I was looking at the map, and this is jumping ahead to 1990, but I was looking at the map of the counties that Jim Pannell won in that primary, and those were Northwest Georgia counties and not Southeast.
Well, they were. There were some dynamics to that affected it, but yeah, the folks up there were very helpful, and that was the theory when we went into the race, that geographically I could make some appeal in Northwest Georgia and also down here.
The friends and family vote.
Yeah.
Very, very strong. A tradition in Georgia politics.
Yeah, we just didn't have enough friends and family, you know. And then the South Georgia part, the pine trees couldn't vote, so we were way outnumbered.
Right. So, you know, we talked about, you know, you grew up in a family of lawyers, something of a political family. How was it that remind us how you got from the University of Georgia up to Washington, D.C. On the Senate staff? So obviously Russell for a day or two,
yeah.
and then David Gambrell.
I graduated from the University of Georgia in 1970 with a BBA degree, and really just wasn't ready to go to law school. I had been in ROTC, was commissioned as second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, went to officer basic training at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, just outside of Washington. And with 2-year commitment, orders for probable assignment, a short tour area, which everybody knew was Vietnam. And the routine then was you'd serve 1 year stateside, you'd go to Vietnam for a year. And that was kind of the normal rotation. They were doing a lot of troop cutbacks in 1970. That's when Nixon was president, and they were negotiating that. And so they came in. I went on active duty July 6th of 70. They came in to the auditorium there for the officer basic class in September and said, we have 27% too many lieutenants in the Army, and we're going to release 50 some odd reserve officers out of this class. And you can apply, and I think about 58 people applied, so they had a little lottery, and those of us who applied, I was among the people who applied and won the lottery. I really wanted, Vietnam was dropping down. We actually had some conscientious objectors in our class, which was kind of interesting. I rode on a Friday afternoon with a young officer from the Northeast, and he took off for Canada that week. It was a trying time. They told us the first week we were there not to wear our uniforms into the District of Columbia or we'd be harassed. And so young soldiers were not being thanked for their service as they are now, which made it a little easier to say, well, get out. Mm-hmm. You could stay, unless you went to Rotary Wing School, which nobody wanted to go to either because the helicopters were coming down in Vietnam regularly, or went what they call vol in def. And the selling point for that was that you could go to Vietnam as a captain as opposed to a lieutenant, which theoretically puts you further away from bullets. But at any rate,
company instead of a platoon.
And I wanted to go to school on the GI Bill, but I thought, well, weighing all the alternatives and the state of the war, that I'd get in that lottery. By the time that was decided, it was too late for me to go to law school, and so I got my resume and started pounding the halls of Congress because I'd been active in student government at the University of Georgia, and I thought, well, I know a lot of people, I'll get a job. And as it turned out, I ended up getting a job with Senator Russell's office.
And that would have been very near the end of his life. Tell me, how did it work again when Senator Russell passed away? Did Charles Campbell explain what the whole process was going to be in terms of Russell's staff and who would stay on with the appointee who turned out to be David Gambrell? How did that work again?
Well, I don't know that there was any real preparation for Russell's death. I went up first of the week expecting to be there for a while, and my job commitment was through the election of '72.
Okay.
With Russell. So when he passed away, they gave the staff, I can't remember what the number was, 30 days, 60 days to wind up the affairs of the office and close it out. Gambrell had no staff. He had been a lawyer in Atlanta, and so he asked Charles to be his administrative assistant, which was the head guy in the office at that time, the title. And then he would start selecting staff. A lot of people who were on Russell's staff ended up working for Gambrell, a lot of the caseworkers and others, and part of that was just Charles organizing it. I think I told the story the last time we talked. Charles came into the office and threw some keys on my desk, and he said, "Do you want to work for the new senator?" And I said, "Well, I need a job." And so he said, "Well, go up to Senator Yarborough's old office." He had been defeated, senator from Texas, and open it up. So I went up to the third floor of what is now the Russell Senate office building and unlocked the door, and there was furniture stacked on furniture, and I was the only staff member for some period of time, and we started taking furniture off and starting to organize the office, really under Charles's direction.
So, again, I don't want to dwell on it since we have an entire other interview on the subject. But looking back, what insights or experience did you take from the Senate office into your later career as an attorney, as a state representative, as a candidate for elective office?
Well, as I mentioned, I'd been following politics. I'd been active in student affairs at the University of Georgia. Like people of my generation, I remember in '60 when Kennedy was elected, that was an electric time for young people. And so I was very much aware of the issues. Ted Kennedy was in the Senate at that time. Hubert Humphrey had returned after being defeated for the presidency. And so it gave me a breadth of knowledge to see a lot of those people in action, and then really come to know a lot of people as you do through any of those staff positions like that.
So tell me about the transition from powerful Washington staffer to 1L at UGA Law School.
Well, the first transition, we went from, Russell was president pro tem in the Senate, and they gave David a tie clip that said 100 on it since he had the last rank in the Senate. So there was a big contrast between the size of those offices and so forth. But it was a heady time. I mentioned before, I could have stayed on with Gambrell. Everything was great, but I was afraid I liked it so much I'd never leave. And so I went back. At that time, you were admitted to law school through military service. And so had already been admitted. I could go back and start in the fall of '71, which I did. And yeah, that was a little different experience. You start scrapping it out with everybody else at that point.
You went from Capitol Hill to North Campus.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, did you know what kind of law you wanted to practice? Was there the Pannells were this kind of lawyer or that kind of lawyer?
Well, Daddy had been a country lawyer in Chatsworth. I used to go down. They had August term of court. I'd follow him down there and watch him try cases. And at that time, the cases tried quicker. A day-long case was a long case. And so I'd go with him to search titles over in Ellett. He had a small-town practice. So I was interested in that. What I really wanted to do coming out of law, when I graduated from law school, I wanted to try cases and maybe get into politics. That was kind of the idea. And I ended up in Savannah, really with no real connection with Savannah, but with a firm, Oliver, Maynard Gray. The guy who really hired me, a guy named Tom Gray, had an active litigation practice, and we had a partner, Ed Maynard, who had gotten in the municipal bond business, and I really worked for Ed and for Tom as a young associate in the law firm.
Now, is that Gray the same Gray?
It is,
the firm
yeah.
now?
Yeah, I've had the same law partner for now 48 years. He was the Gray and Oliver Maynard Gray. In 2007, my son John had come to practice with us, and we, by that time, had built up a fairly sizable municipal bond practice, and so we formed Gray Pannell and what is now Gray Pannell and Woodward to do municipal bond work. And we had clients all over the state, and John was coming on, and it was just easier to do that, have a specialty practice. You eliminated conflicts of interest. I didn't have to go to, I'd been the managing partner at Oliver Maynard Gray for a number of years, and I didn't have to go to any more firm meetings and listen to all that. So we went from 25 lawyers to initially 4 lawyers, I guess, and we're still very small.
So I think our friend Ted Hester is also a municipal bond lawyer. That was his specialty.
Yeah, Ted had worked for Smythe Gambrell, who's David's father, doing litigation, and then after Gambrell was defeated, Ted took a job with what was then Gambrell and Mobley and did bond work for a number of years, and then from that firm went with King and Spalding doing bond work. And that's probably one reason I knew what it was and had some interest in it when the opportunity came open down here, because there were only 3 or 4 firms in the state who did that. Oliver Maynard Gray was one, and the only one outside of Atlanta, so it seemed like a good opportunity to do more than one thing.
Now, why was that it was such a specialty practice? At that time.
Well, it's actually pretty simple, and it's still a specialty practice, but at that time, the underwriting community would not take your opinion unless you were in the bond buyer directory, the Red Book. You could not be in the Red Book unless you'd given 3 independent opinions in the prior year. So it was catch-22 if you wanted to get in the business. Ed had been the city attorney for Savannah in the 1950s, late 1950s, and he was involved in a number of financings and decided, well, gosh, I can do that. And so he started co-signing opinions with a firm out of New York and built up his practice from that. Mills B. Lane, who was then the head of CNS Bank, was from Savannah, and Mr. Lane bought 3 little bond issues that Ed had assembled together, so he got in the book. And that gave us the nucleus to start really competing. At that time, Gambrell and Mobley, King and Spalding, and our firm did most of that kind of work. What was the predecessor for Alston and Byrd, Kilpatrick, Stockton, Jones, Byrd, what was Jones, Byrd, and Howell, which was a forerunner of Alston and Byrd, did some state bond work. But as far as the cities and counties and so forth, it was really King and Spalding, Gambrell and Mobley, and Oliver Maynard Gray.
So that was the vast majority of your municipal bonds were cities, towns,
Yeah.
townships.
It was. Ed had kind of assembled some clients. He had done some work in Macon and Columbus were the bigger clients. Savannah, obviously. And then he, along with a guy named Cliff Adams, in '76 came up with the idea for the Municipal Electric Authority of Georgia. And I had the pleasure of getting in the library and researching the charters of all 50-something cities that had their own electric distribution systems, and was involved when that legislation was passed in '76. It was driven by the fact that Georgia Power was trying to build nuclear plants, Hatch and Vogel.
What is old is new again.
And
right?
they could not get financing to do it. And so they'd done something like this in North Carolina. And the idea was to create an authority that could contract with the cities and there are a couple of counties that had electric distribution systems to provide security for the payment of the bonds of the authority. And that mousetrap worked. And I remember being in a little meeting with Lex Jolly, who was the initial underwriter, and he was saying, they're looking at these numbers, said we could do $800 million worth of bonds, and everybody's going, gosh, that'd be great. Well, of course, they've issued billions and billions of dollars worth of bonds at this point.
Right.
As the size of those plants. And it's been a great thing for those cities because those cities with electric distribution systems, there's some of them that don't even have ad valorem taxes, you know, because they make enough money off of those utilities to run the city.
So you said you wanted to be a lawyer and you also wanted to get into politics. So how did you remain active during that time? So the mid-late 70s, early 1980s, how did you stay active in
Well,
in
it
Georgia
wasn't
politics?
hard because I knew these folks and so who were running. And the first race in '74 was a runoff between Busby and Lester Maddox for governor when I got down here. And so I tried to do whatever I could to help the people who were for George Busby. And of course he won. And then when Sam Nunn ran for re-election, which would have been '78, I was very much involved in that. In '80, I had a close relationship with Senator Talmadge. When he would come down here, I used to be the guy that picked him up at the airport and get him around and so forth. But after his overcoat incident and so forth, I liked Ms. Talmadge a lot too. I got a little disenchanted with that. Norman Underwood announced he would run, and I decided I would support Norman, which created a lot of consternation among the only way I've ever regretted that decision was Rogers Wade, who was Talmadge's administrative assistant. He had been very kind to me, very nice to me, and I really always felt like I betrayed Rogers a little bit, but I was on my principled high horse at that point, and so we supported Norman, and of course Norman the runoff got between Zell Miller and Talmadge, and so I sort of came back in the Talmadge fold, and then of course Talmadge won the Democratic nomination, but then lost the general election to Mac Mattingly.
Right. So another race would have been like 1982, where Norman ran again for governor, but that was a really contested race with Bo Ginn and Joe Frank Harris, and so you had a geographic. So you may have been a little torn with the.
Well, you did well,
Northwest.
and is that trying to get my years right with David too? No, David was not in that. Bo Ginn, my wife Karen, had campaigned for Bo Ginn in 1972. She was from Millen, Georgia, where he was from, and was part of a group of young people that traveled around the first district. And so we had and Bo had been nice to me as well when he was Talmadge's administrative assistant. So we were really kind of torn, and had basically already committed to Bo before Norman made the decision to get in the race.
I see.
And I was busy practicing law as well, so I wasn't going to be much help to anybody. So my heart was torn, and that one didn't feel right going into it with Norman anyway. I don't know if he felt that way or not, but it turned out then being a runoff between Joe Frank Harris and Bo Ginn.
Right.
And Harris won, and that pretty well ended Ginn's career. And then, of course, unfortunately, he had then started having financial problems that led to worse things for him. But he was a great first district congressman, and a great family.
So what convinced you in 1984 that it was time for Jim Pannell to throw his hat in the ring himself?
Well, Ronnie Ginsburg had been the representative for 2 terms out of the 122nd district, which is where I lived and Ronnie lived. And Ronnie, to my surprise, came to me one day and said he wasn't going to run again. So, taking a job when I was interviewing jobs in a law firm, I had a guy tell me, and it's true in politics, he says, it's kind of like running a play in football. You can grab the football and run through the line if there's an opening there and make a touchdown, but you can't if there's not an opening. And that's the way it is in politics. I mean, somebody else, strong person, get in those seats, you can't ever get them out of it. So it was kind of my opportunity to have that opening to run for the legislature. So I did, and we had a contested race, and I won, fortunately. It was an interesting race because my district, there was no Republican opponent. My district was basically half African American and half white.
Okay.
And it was a great district to represent. And at that time, the whites voted in the Democratic primary, so that was good for me. I had a black opponent, a young lawyer who was a nice guy. But the thing that struck me in that race, I remember going to a fundraiser in Ardsley Park for me. You're raising $50, $100 contributions. We ran the whole campaign on less than $20,000. But I went to that reception, and then I went, and it was the corner of Abercorn and 52nd Street. I went west on 52nd Street to Montgomery, where the Bingville post office is. I took a left. I went 2 blocks to a little church that was there on that corner to meet with the people in that church. African American congregation. And it struck me when I walked in the door, I might as well have been on different planets as far as the concerns of those people.
I see.
The people in Ardsley Park were more concerned about property taxes, income taxes, their personal business. The people over on Montgomery Street were more interested in their survival and crime in their neighborhood, and job opportunities, and school dropouts, and teenage pregnancy, and all those social issues that impacted the minority community so much harder than they did, 6 blocks away.
Wow.
So I had that contrast, and I enjoyed doing it. It was because it forced me to start trying to understand the economic problems and social problems in the minority community, while paying attention to I couldn't go too far left and I couldn't go too far right and survive. And I kept trying to reach out. I would bring African American pages up to page in the Senate, and the black caucus wouldn't let me caucus with them because I wasn't black. They wanted my seat, but But I got to know at that time the people who in Savannah had really been the civil rights leaders. W.W. Law wasn't in my district, but he was across the street. And then the people who had been active in the 50s and 60s all became my constituents. They lived out in Liberty City or Can Park. Beach High School was in my district. And so it was a great education for me.
Was Savannah, I don't know nearly as much about Savannah as I do Atlanta and the metro area. Was Savannah a racially segregated, divided city where it was, like you said, there were black neighborhoods, there were white neighborhoods? Was that a hard division here in Savannah?
Yes, very much so. And in Savannah, it was more so because it was more compact. If you went at that time, once you got below Forsyth Park, Gaston Street, you were in basically a black neighborhood all the way to Victory Drive. And then as you go down, if you know the geography, as you went down Bull Street, on the left-hand side, east side, would have been Ardsley Park. On the right side was Bingville, which had become a transitional, it was a working class neighborhood that had become mostly African American by the time I represented the district. And then everything west of there, all the way to Lions Parkway, was African American. And yeah, it was very geographically divided. Now, as far as working together, Savannah in the 60s, and I know this only from reading about it, I wasn't here, fortunately had a good mayor, Malcolm McLean, at the time of the demonstrations and so forth, and there was a business community like there was in Atlanta that wasn't going to let it blow apart. And Mr. Law was the president of the NAACP, and he had young people integrating the schools, doing the demonstrations and so forth, but there was a constant dialogue there. And one of the things that was interesting when I got into politics was that those folks by instinct knew who they could trust and who they couldn't. They'd been down that road with many white candidates for many different offices. Excuse me, I've got a cold.
Oh, no, that's perfectly fine. No, I think that's, I think if we jump ahead to the redistricting processes in 91,
right?
You know, you mentioned, now of course you weren't a candidate for re-election in
Right,
the
I was
State
out.
House, so you wouldn't have gone through that but you had mentioned the Legislative Black Caucus,
Right.
and there was a concerted effort to redistrict the state to the benefit of African American Democrats and white Republicans. Right. What do you think the effect of that has been on like you said, racially diverse districts and the way that Georgia politics and Southern politics and American politics has developed is that racially diverse districts meant politically diverse districts. What do you think the effects of that has been?
I think the gerrymandering, political gerrymandering, is a cancer on the American democracy. And the Supreme Court has condoned it, and it is the reason that we are so divided, one of the reasons that we are so divided in this country, and the people who've exploited it on both sides. Where you've really seen it is you carve out these districts where the Republican congressman doesn't have to pay any attention to the minority community within his district. Even it may be 30%, it may be 35%, but the politics is such that they take one position at the other. Same thing in reverse, and because the numbers are so skewed, and we were a lot better off, I think, when you had folks like me and others who really had to pay attention to both sides to survive. The fellow who succeeded me, Tom Bordeaux, was there for 16 years in the same district. The demographics changed somewhat during that time, and then he was succeeded by an African American in what is essentially that same district. But by then the whites are voting in Republican primaries. My biggest fear, and I had opposition 2 out of the 3 times I ran. My biggest fear was that there would be a hotly contested Republican primary that would draw off the voters from my primary, and then I would become vulnerable, because try as I might, and I went to a lot of meetings and I did a lot of things, people, whites and blacks, all things being equal, are gonna vote. Race is gonna have a lot to do with what they say, and so I could carry, in those races, the 2 contested races, I carried 30-something% of the black vote, and the black candidate was getting maybe 10% of the white vote, and on election day it was probably evenly split, so I won. But that same district now with a Republican primary, you, as a white candidate, you probably could not do that.
Right, right. So tell me, had you spent a lot of time at the Georgia Capitol growing up? You had moved to Atlanta at some point in the 60s?
Yeah, when I was growing up, Dad was in the legislature, so I'd go down in Page when I was, 12 years old or whatever, and then, well, even older than that. And then he was the North Georgia campaign manager for Carl Sanders when he ran for governor. And I lived at the Dinkler Plaza Hotel, which was their headquarters, that summer as a age 13 going on 14. And so, and then they had a special session when I was in high school, and I worked in the Senate Secretary's office printing bills at night, because then no copy machines. It was all, they'd take stuff, and so I worked down there, and I was a doorman down there at that time, just because, again, through my father, I knew those folks, and so I knew, all of the constitutional officers, and whether they knew me or not, I knew who they were.
So you weren't a starstruck neophyte when you showed up in 1985. You knew what the Capitol was like, and who the main players were. Right. So, but tell me, what was it like being a freshman Democrat in the General Assembly in 1985?
Well, it was you were clearly in the majority. There was not a struggle for that. Johnny Isakson was the minority leader. Luther Colbert was the minority whip. There were good relations back and forth. I know Johnny made the comment to me one day that with Tom Murphy, who everybody perceived to be just a staunch Democrat, that you could love Tom Murphy one minute, you could hate him the next, and which was true even as a freshman legislator. And Tom Murphy knew something about me because he and my father served in the legislature together. So I was kind of a favored child when I got there. And I was willing to work, and I was a young lawyer, and I thought I was pretty smart. And so I ended up on Judiciary Committee, which was great, and from my point of view, and then Natural Resources and Health and Ecology. And then after that first term, I wanted to drop health and ecology because I was tired of the doctors and the lawyers and the nurses and everybody fighting with each other, and tried to anyway. The deal was he left me on health and ecology, but he put me on ways and means. So I had to drop natural resources, which was kind of my first love in a way. But and so I worked there and tried to be helpful. As a lawyer in the legislature, I guess this is still true. The legislators rely on the office of the Legislative Council and the lawyers there, and there's some very able people there. But at that time, we had no staff, we had no office. There was not even a fax machine in the state capitol in 1985, much less any computers. That was before computers and email. And so I'd sit down there as a lawyer and help people redraft bills and all kinds of stuff, insert language, and so you become kind of the lawyer for those that are around you in the seating arrangement. And Denny Groover was then, and he's one of the smartest lawyers I've ever known. He'd been in the legislature forever. He was there off and on forever. He was there at 7 o'clock in the morning reading the daily readers, and he knew everything that was going on, and I sort of followed Denny's model to some extent, because he was on Judiciary Committee. And then every time the speaker would get a hot bill, usually on abortion or something like that, he would refer it to the Judiciary Committee, which would then end up in the Groover Subcommittee. And I was part of the Groover Subcommittee, and we would sit on it or do whatever we had to do to keep the pot from boiling over. Was part of our job. And but I learned a lot. There were people there. The thing about it being a freshman legislator, I couldn't figure out initially how Denny Groover and Speaker Murphy knew kind of what every bill was about. Murphy could look at the back of a bill, and when he would assign it to committees, and tell you everybody that was for it and against it and what had come up, because they're the same issues. They are repeated, but that's, they're refined, but it's a lot of the same issues time and time again. So after a term or two, I'd kind of figured out that game plan, and we were. So it was a lot of fun. I had a great time doing it and learned a lot in the process.
One of the complaints or views of the House under Speaker Murphy was how concentrated the power was, whether it was in the Speaker's office or the Green Door Committee.
Right.
What's your take on in terms of where power rested and how the members could exercise power, sort of either not necessarily outside of the Speaker, but at least worked within that system?
Well, I did it by trying to be more knowledgeable than other folks. Be able to read, write, and handle things. And so I was asked to handle legislation by the Secretary of State's office and others just because I would actually read it and do something with it. And so that was how I tried to develop influence. But it was very frustrating because the committee chairmen were universally people who had been there for a while, had supported Murphy when he was challenged for the Speaker by Al Burris a few years before that. And so it was one of my reasons, I guess it went into, after I'd been there 6 years running for lieutenant governor, was I kind of got frustrated with and figured out I'm either going to go home and practice law or I'm going to be one of the big shots around here. And so the voters decided I didn't need to be a big shot, and I came back to Savannah to practice law.
Well, before you came back, and passed up your chance of being a big shot, did you have much? You mentioned, briefly the Republicans and Johnny Isakson, but did you have much interaction with the Republican caucus or the individual Republican members? What was the inter-party dynamic like back then?
Not as a caucus. I wasn't on the pay grade to be negotiating with caucuses, but on an individual basis, we worked together all the time. When I was a freshman, I had a bill, I can't remember what the bill was right now, that had been assigned to Ways and Means, and Luther Colbert, the minority leader, came and sat down by me on the floor one day and said, "The Speaker has asked me to help you with your bill." And I thought, is this a trick? What is this? But Luther was a very active and good member of the Ways and Means committees, and Tom Murphy, I guess, liked what I'd introduced and liked me, and so he asked Luther to help me with it. And it was that kind of camaraderie. Now, they would go through the motions of nominating a speaker to run, and all the Republicans would vote for Johnny to be speaker as opposed to Murphy, but that was more pro forma than anything else. Now, it got more serious as the Republicans gained power, and as Murphy pointed to the end, toward the end of when I was there, he got up in one of these caucus meetings and said, "The Republicans only want one thing, and that's your seat. And that was something you had to be reminded of, I guess. There wasn't a Republican that was probably in the short term going to win my district, but that was not true elsewhere. And of course, it started turning over rapidly, where a lot of good people, including Tom Murphy, were defeated by Republicans in the early 1990s.
So, if the Republicans weren't really a potent opposition, what were the important dividing lines in the General Assembly, ideologically, politically, geographically?
Well, there have always been dividing lines, and of course, thinking about issues. You know, the doctors were all for tort reform when I was on the Judicial Committee. The trial lawyers were all against tort reform, and we were kind of in the middle, which when I ran for lieutenant governor didn't help me, because I thought people, you go in naively thinking people really want your judgment and expertise, when boil it down on who they're going to support in an election, they want your soul. You know, and it's worse today. At that time, and I was basically pro-choice, but which worked well in my district, but now, of course, if you're a Democrat, you got to be pro-choice. If you're a Republican, you got to be pro-life. If you're a Republican, you got to be against all forms of gun control, apparently, to be successful. And if as a Democrat, it's the opposite. Ours was more around special interest groups, and that struggle for power that comes through. There was always a conflict, and I got to be the chairman of the Health Professions Subcommittee, which was the worst subcommittee in the House, because every time the chiropractors wanted to be able to prescribe drugs, or the nurses, or the professional, or the nurse practitioners, the PAs, and so forth, there would be this conflict, and it would be between the doctors and who had the money and were more powerful than these little groups. And of course, I was popular with all the little groups because I'd at least listen to them, and not as popular with the doctors as I would have been otherwise. And so, but it was more issue oriented, and then rural and urban was a big deal.
Right.
And of course, easier for me, I was from Savannah. My father had been a rural legislator, which was a different type thing. At the time, there was a big struggle between Tom Moreland, who was the head of the DOT, and Tom Murphy, who didn't like each other. And so you had to pick sides. And I had a legislator who'd been around for a long time and had supported Al Burris against, and so he was one kind of the older outcast in the House. But we used to eat breakfast together, and he told me, he said, this session there's going to be a struggle between Speaker Murphy and the commissioner of the Highway Department, Tom Moreland, who was from my home county.
Right.
And I'd known he and his family all my life. He said, and when that comes, you stick with the Speaker. And he said, that's going to sound kind of strange for me because I'm a Moreland man. But he said, he said, the Speaker understands you've got your own politics, and you can help him at times and you can't help him at other times. Tom Murphy wants it his way all the time. Or Tom Moreland wants it his way all the time. And I took his advice, so when the battle came, I stuck with Murphy.
That sounds very similar to a story that Richard Royal told about that. I think this
Well,
same
it could
episode.
be, yeah.
You know, the dig against Tom Moreland was he was since we're here in South Georgia, Mr. Jim in a Brooks Brothers suit. Mr. Jim being Jim Gillis.
Yeah, Jim Gillis, right.
Who is the longtime potentate of the highway department. So you were there for the transition from Tom Moreland to Hal Reeves, I think, was the
Well, it came right after I did. Where Moreland would get involved is you have the district people on the DOT board.
Right.
And so there'd be a Murphy guy and there would be a Moreland guy. And Moreland would fly down in the DOT jet and and monitor the caucus to see who was with him and who wasn't, and so forth. And I guess after one or two of those things, even though I was from his hometown, he wasn't as big a fan of mine as he might have been otherwise.
So during this period of time in the 80s, I think it was 1985 actually, is when UGA professor Charles Floyd, he published the Two Georgias
Right.
Thesis, which is to say that there is Atlanta or the metro areas,
Right.
and there's everywhere else.
Yeah.
How did the legislature try to address those rural versus urban suburban disparities during your time?
I don't know that the legislature itself addressed those or did anything to help them. It became a big political issue.
Sure.
And when I ran in 1990, it was a big deal, Two Georgias. And I gave more than one speech on that, depending on where I was, about Two Georgias. And there was that great disparity in income and job opportunities and so forth that continues today. As you see what's happened, where, Georgia itself has gone from, 5 or 6 million people to 13 million people, but a lot of counties are losing population. There's
Right.
no job opportunities there and so forth, and it's a problem that never got addressed. And healthcare was part of that. I knew that
Sure.
from health and ecology. And of course, since that time, you've had a lot of rural hospitals that have closed, and the state has not done enough to give any real direction to that or provide health care across the state. They kind of let those go by the wayside. And part of that is the local politics. All politics is local, according to Tip O'Neill, and it is to the extent that if you're in a small county with a hospital that's one of your largest employers, you're going to support that hospital to the last breath until it has to close or whatever. You're not going to want it just to be an emergency clinic for the big county next door. And those kinds of things that on a state level, perhaps there could have been better guidance, didn't happen. I know at one time Larry Walker was very interested, and they had a committee that went around the state about consolidating counties.
It's like you're reading my mind. That was the next question.
And I watched that and thinking, if you're the sheriff of Crawford County, you're not really for that, because you're going to get gobbled up by the bigger counties next door. They also started, and I guess this happened maybe in the 90s, where they had passed this bill for regional jail authorities, because and the whole idea was same thing, kind of economies of scale.
Right.
With these rural counties, well, you're the sheriff of the small county, you're not going to want the jail in your neighbor's county. You want them, you're the high sheriff in your county, and so consequently, we still have 159 counties. Anybody sitting down academically should be consolidated into, pick a number, 60 counties, whatever the number is, but the political power bases are such that has been impossible to do, and it has strangled the local economies in a lot of little counties.
Right. I mean, we talk about Two Georgias or rural. Probably, and Charlie Hazlett, who's done a lot of work on this, especially on healthcare in rural counties. But all you have to do is, and this, is drive from Athens to Savannah. Take the back roads, and you sort of see how Georgia has changed, how Georgia's economy and society has changed. And obviously, that's true in a lot of places.
The part of the state you're talking about driving through at the time of the Civil War was the richest part of the state. It was the cotton country. It was the slave country. It was
Wilkes County.
Yeah, you just go down through it, Crawfordville, all Tolliver County, all those down there, who have, when you go down there, I think there's one of the highways that's the Georgia Confederate Leaders Highway or something. Down that way.
I think it's also Washington, Wilkes area.
Yeah, you've got, you had Robert Toombs, and you had Alexander Stevens, and they were from those little areas down there. and of course now it's some of the poorest areas in the state. And as the politics changed, I have a guy we do a good bit of business with who lives in Thompson, Georgia, McDuffie County, who grew up in Tolliver County, where Alexander Stevens was from, and he said that when he was growing up, his parents told him, even though they had land that he had to get out of that county. He was from Hancock.
Okay.
And Hancock was,
Hancock
80% minority, and the politics shifted very quickly there. And it's been most unfortunate for the economic prosperity of those folks, and you've got this permanent underclass that came off of those old farms and plantations, and same thing down here. And now there's a lot of talk about generational wealth, generational education, and so forth. That gap has widened, and it has held us all back.
Well, while we were sitting here talking about, you mentioned, Tolliver County and Alexander Stevens, and I looked it up, and the population of Tolliver County is 1,559. The entire county.
Yeah.
So.
And they have a sheriff, they have a clerk of court, they have a probate judge, they have all those constitutional officers, and then they've got a couple of cities, and so,
what they have is no tax base, obviously.
Other than they've got some landowners, and then the people that own the land have figured out over time how to get constitutional amendments for so you can assess timberland and farmland different. And I'm not saying that it ain't fair to take some guy just because he's got more land and lay all the taxes on him, but it's created that widening gap and gap in opportunity where you gotta leave home to prosper it all. And of course, the good news for a place like Savannah, it used to be Atlanta. Now Savannah's growing well. Columbus seems to be doing well. Macon area, Houston County particularly below Macon, doing well. Valdosta is doing well. Northeast Georgia is doing well. And so it's not just one, it's not two Georgias anymore. There's more, it's more complex than that.
Well, a couple more national championships and Athens will be, I'm telling you, it is, and it's a good problem to have. Speaking as a graduate of the University of Georgia and an employee of the University of Georgia, you would rather have high enrollments and lots of traffic as opposed to declining enrollments and low enrollments and the issues that come along with that.
Well, what you got though in that, and I've got a law partner, Jim Woodward, who grew up in Atlanta, went to Stanford, went to Virginia. He's living in Atlanta. He's got his children up at Lovett. It's taken him 30 minutes to get to the school and then 30 minutes to get to his office in Buckhead. And so about 3 years ago, he and his wife moved to Athens. And there's a lot of that going on. The reputation of Atlanta for crime and other things has driven a lot of people out of Atlanta to Athens and even to Macon and elsewhere. It's a changing dynamic that.
Oh sure, I mean, and I think.
And remote work's helped with that. I mean, the pandemic's accelerated it.
Sure.
And where it all ends. Maybe some of these counties with rural broadband and other things can catch up. They'll get some key people. The leadership got eroded in those places. Mm-hmm. And because to have opportunities like the guy I was talking about, his parents saw for him no future in Hancock County. And so he moved. And I'm sure for 100 years they'd been the leaders in that county.
Right.
And that's just, it's true all around. My wife's from Millen, Georgia, same thing. It's because the people, when we were first married, now 48 years ago, who were they owned the Ford dealership, and they had the hardware store, and they had the gift shop, and they had the the administrator of the hospital, and you had that network of people who were the economy, and they're not there anymore because the Walmart opened up down in Statesboro, and the car dealerships merged, and so they had a Ford dealer and a Chevrolet dealer. They're not there anymore. In 2007-8, they had 1,500 manufacturing jobs in that county, and they went from there to 0. They have now come back with a few. And so if you're in a county like that, and then you start trying to get them to build a prison, you there, so you'll have some jobs, and it's a terrible dilemma. I admire a lot of people who've kind of stuck with it and tried to bring prosperity, but it's been a tough job for them unless they're, Statesboro's a good example. Statesboro's grown because of Georgia Southern, but it's, the counties around it necessarily have not had that. Screven, Sylvania, Millen, just hadn't been able to participate in that much other than as, anyway, bedroom communities for people who want to live out in the country somewhere.
Right. Well, and this is jumping ahead a bit in the interview, but here in Savannah, all you have to do is stand on River Street for a few minutes, and you'll see the biggest ship you've ever seen in your life. Yeah. Maybe not, it might be not the QE2, but these are big boats.
They're bigger than the QE2.
Yeah, I mean, these things are huge. And what has that meant economically? Obviously, for Chatham County and Savannah, the impact is obvious. But what about Bryan County, Effingham County, around there? Those seem to be some of the fastest growing.
Well, they are.
Jackson County up in North Georgia is fast growing.
Well, Coney
too.
County from Athens.
Right.
Well, unfortunately, in the big defining, and I had hoped growing up after the Civil Rights Movement and so forth that race would not be the predominant issue throughout my lifetime. But it's still ever present. Part of the growth in Bryan County and Effingham County has been schools. Richmond Hill has a great school system, perceived to be. Effingham, to some extent, as they have become bedroom communities. And it was first white flight, and now it's economic flight in a way. You get a lot of African Americans and others who are moving into those areas as well because they perceive more of a problem within the Chatham-Savannah school system. They can go get a, quote, better school outside the county, so it's created that. But then it's opened up jobs in this area. We're about to have a huge transformation down here west of Savannah in Bryan County when they build an 8,000 employee Hyundai plant, and that's just the beginning because all the suppliers are now going to open up, and where those people are going to live and where they're going to work and how they're going to get there on the infrastructure we have. And so we're bursting at the seams, and it's the kind of thing, if you're a lawyer like we are, that you prosper off of. My son is the lawyer for the Savannah Economic Development Authority and the Joint Development Authority doing the project out on I-16 for Hyundai.
And that's the one that our friend Eric Johnson's
has been involved with, And but I've joked with John. I said, "You're going to destroy my quality of life. You may make a lot of money out of this, but and it will be better for the economy locally. But you've got all those collateral issues that are going to affect us as well. And Athens is going to get some of that from to me, Athens and Savannah are the two best places to live in the state. And everybody else has figured that out too, so they're all trying to get there.
Yeah, Athens, we just got, we're building a very large soundstage for the entertainment industry. And then right up the road in Jackson County, you've got all the SK battery investments and Amazon, and it seems like Senator Ossoff's in Jackson County every other. I don't know. Maybe it just feels like that, but I'm sure he's down here at the ports and at these, all you have to do is drive in on I-16 and you look over on the side and you say, oh, that's where they're building.
Oh yeah, it looks like the Great Plains out there.
I was like, I don't remember this.
They've cleared over 3,000 acres, and
Wow.
you look straight across it to a tree line.
And you have to imagine that that's what it looked like in between Marietta and Smyrna when they were building Bell Bomber and Lockheed.
Yeah.
Just that's what it was like. And as we know, is somebody who grew up during that time and somebody who studied it is radically transformed. Cobb County and the metro area. So buckle up, I guess.
And of course the politics has been, and we've just had we've had a series of governors who promoted economic development above all, and that's been good politics for them, and everybody wants growth. Unfortunately, the same kind of folks that we were talking about earlier don't get to participate in that growth because they don't own the land that's being sold to Hyundai. They may have a trailer out there somewhere that on a little piece of property they probably don't own, and they're going to be displaced by it. And yeah, they may get a few more dollars an hour working at the Hyundai plant than they have gotten doing whatever they do, but it's not. The opportunities are not going to be equally distributed,
right?
Unfortunately,
right. Not everybody's a landowner. Not everybody's a municipal bond attorney.
Well, that's right.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean that's it. One of the other issues that on the flip side is instead of having county consolidation like we talked about, it is a cityhood movement and secession movements. How was Speaker Murphy and the Democratic Party able to, like you say, keep a lid on that issue during your time, and what's become of the issue since you left?
Well, I don't think they did.
Okay.
When I was in the House, Wilmington Island, which is east of Savannah between here and Tybee, wanted to incorporate, and Jack Kingston represented that district, and it was his politics to do that. I represented a city of Savannah district, and we did not want that. And so we did that battle, and as it turned out, it was never incorporated. On the west side of the county, when Sonny Dixon became the representative, every Bloomingdale, Garden City, Port Wentworth, all those little cities, Pooler, wanted to expand their boundaries so Savannah wouldn't gobble them up.
And Sonny was the mayor of Garden City.
He was a councilman in Garden City.
He was councilman, okay.
But so that was his territory, and we went through that battle then, and unfortunately, the way the rules worked, Murphy kind of allowed him, to do local legislation like that, we had a rule that you had to get a majority of the legislators from the county. There were 7 representatives. You had to get 5 of them plus had 2 senators. A majority of that 9 had to be for the local bill, or excuse me, in the House. Both senators had to be for it.
Okay.
5 of the 7 in the House to get the local bill through to keep it getting removed from the general calendar. Murphy made a parliamentary ruling that basically those cities were only within Sonny's district, so he didn't have to get our votes. And I think he was dead wrong, and I told him so, and he didn't like it. And but consequently, what happened was they annexed a lot of pine trees, which are now where these plants are going, and so you're going to have what you got in Birmingham, Alabama, and these other places. Same thing. You got these little cities. You're crossing. Los Angeles has some. A lot of these where you've got that polarization, when really what you ought to have is, in my view, a consolidated government like Macon-Bibb went to, like Columbus went to, like Augusta is now gone to. Athens-Clarke, because we couldn't do it here because there were too many municipalities. And so that opportunity has been lost forever. Interestingly, because Savannah controls the water and sewer, its city limits are now just kind of wandering out wherever somebody wants to have a subdivision, and because they can't get water and sewer unless they get annexed into the city. It's more complicated than that, but that's the only thing that's let Savannah expand.
And I assume that Speaker Murphy, and again, the Speaker of the House is the parliamentarian of the House. He makes the final decision. He did not make a similar decision on, for example, Sandy Springs, and
well, it's different. Consistency is a hobgoblin of small minds. You can't.
I'll let our friend Bob Irvin. I'll remind him of that. So you were talking about all the municipalities, and you're talking to somebody who grew up in and around St. Louis, Missouri, and all the municipalities.
Oh yeah, St. Louis is a good example of that. Sure.
Yeah, you can throw a rock and it'll roll through 3 or 4 townships. So looking at your run for lieutenant governor, and we talked about it a little bit before we started. I think mercifully the tree service folks have taken a lunch break.
Yeah.
We talked about it briefly about how 1990 was really, in your opinion, a watershed moment in how campaigns were organized and run in Georgia. So tell me about that, and then tell me about your personal experience as running for LG.
Well, I had watched, as we talked about earlier, Georgia politics. My first real time of following was when Sanders ran in '62, and then, of course, you had those years of progression, and then all of a sudden Lester Maddox gets elected, really as a backlash to what was happening in '64, '65 with Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and Talmadge being perceived as being, more of a moderate peacemaker, and then progressive as the measure then. But in Georgia, at least, the campaigns I'd been involved in, including up until 1990, had been driven by, it used to be the courthouse crowds. Back in the old Talmadge days, the courthouse crowds controlled it. You had 159 counties. Of course, you had the county unit system until the early 60s, and it really was that. So if you had the support of the constitutional officers in Trutland County, you had 2 unit votes. If you had the support of everybody in Chatham County, you had a total of 6 unit votes. Well, you
do some quick math.
Eccles County had 1,500 votes back then, early '60s, or 1,500 citizens. Savannah or Fulton County had over 500,000. Fulton had 6 unit votes. Eccles had 2. So the math wasn't working out. That was thrown out, one man, one vote in '62 when Sanders actually won. Although he would have interestingly won under a county unit system, the way that it worked out.
Which says something about Governor Griffin.
Yeah,
I think.
Well, they what his old line was, they ate my barbecue, they didn't vote for me. But the politics then was he'd have these big rallies in Americus and Bainbridge and wherever else.
Right.
And Sanders tried to follow that model. His kickoff was in Statesboro because his wife was from there. But by then, people had televisions and they had other entertainment besides going eating and barbecue. And also, Saturday was a big day in rural places because you'd come off the farm and you'd go to town and you'd go to the movies, and all that was breaking down as being different. And so that's what you did. And so when I started running for lieutenant governor, I thought I could out-organize them. And we had really a pretty good organization around the state. But what we didn't have was money. And in 1990, what I realized after it was all over was money was the only thing that really counted, because you had to be able to spend as much money, particularly in the Atlanta media market, as your opponents. Otherwise, you were unknown. You didn't have any credibility. And the 2 people in my mind who understood that were James Carville, who was running Zell Miller's campaign because of what he had done in other states, and Tim Riles, who was elected insurance commissioner, both as Democrats. And what they did was they grabbed one big issue. Tim Riles, when I'd go around the state, and everybody else was there besides Zell Miller and Tim Riles. I mean, all these people running for office, every hog calling in the state, you'd be there. You'd have somebody. You're handing out brochures. You're doing whatever, doing retail politics.
Right. Right.
Well, what Zell Miller did was, because he had been a lieutenant governor for years, is he raised money. He had been to all those places before. He had been elected on a shoestring before. And so he raised more money than anybody else to control the media going into the primary, which was a one-day sale. It was one-day election then. You backed up from election day with your TV and radio ads and went back as far as you could, a week or two or whatever, to dominate those airwaves when people are making up their minds. Riles did it with a very limited budget, where he had one ad, as I recall. He was standing above the interstate with cars going underneath this bridge he was standing on, and he said, "I will lower your insurance, auto insurance rates, no ifs, ands, or buts." And he won. And I know I had some conversations with Pierre Howard, who was elected governor afterward, and we were kind of comparing notes. Well, where did you have an organization? Where didn't you? And I had a pretty good little organization in Chattahoochee County, which was just south of Columbus. I'd done some bond issues over there, and then I had the county attorney, and I knew the officials and so forth. And I said, "What organization do you have in Chattahoochee County?" He said, "None." He carried Chattahoochee County. He carried it because of Columbus Television. And I think he would acknowledge that. And so where we faltered is, I thought you could out-organize them. I also thought that both Pierre Howard and Joe Kennedy wouldn't get in the race, and if that happened, I could get either the good old boys or the sophisticates to support me. And when they both got in, neither one were available fully. And so being from Savannah, I was a kind of odd man out. And
you weren't even the only Savannah area candidate.
No, I was not. And I still don't know exactly how that happened.
Not to pick at a
Bobby
sore
Hill
spot.
had been a disgraced legislator who I knew very fine, and all of a sudden he jumps in the race. Now, what they used to do, and I'll go all the way back, in 1961, 62, Carl Sanders was going to run for governor, or lieutenant governor. Mm-hmm. That's what he wanted to run for. And Peter Zach Geer, who was the lieutenant governor, and others, or got elected lieutenant governor, got a guy named Carl S. Sanders somewhere, and he qualifies, or is announced as for lieutenant governor, and which would have created so much confusion that Carl E. Sanders from Augusta would have been lost, and that was one of the driving factors that got Carl E. Sanders running for governor. Before Garland Byrd, who was the presumptive guy against Marvin Griffin, who was running for re-election, was in it at the time. So the leader, Sanders, was there for however long, a few weeks, and then Byrd dropped out, and Sanders became the main opponent. And so I relate that to, there are a lot of times when people who don't want you elected will go get somebody else in the race. Whether that happened with Bobby, I really don't know, but when he got in, I went, uh-oh, because again, I had built a good reputation in the African-American community, but Bobby Hill was a celebrity in the African-American community, and that cost me Chatham County because Tom Coleman, who was a state senator here, was for Joe Kennedy, and he was probably the most powerful politician in the county. As I say, I had hoped that Joe wouldn't run. As it turned out, and our strategy was, we're going to announce first and it'll keep somebody out. Well, it didn't keep either one of the real opponents out. And so Kennedy had been a good senator from down here. He'd helped supported the port, done other things. And so it eroded my base here. And so I carried the city of Savannah, but not Chatham County. That's the way it kind of worked out. And so, timing is everything in politics, and our timing was not good.
Well, what did you do with yourself after you left politics and you moved back to Savannah full time?
Well, I was $50,000 in debt.
Oh, this isn't a good start, Jim.
I had children who were, what would they have been? 9 and 12, who presumably would want to go to college at some point. And so I came back to my law office and decided that I needed to practice law, which I did. And, and it worked out great from that standpoint. I've teased my wife all these years. We were lying in bed one night after that race, and I don't recommend running and losing. It's not fun. And she said, when we were running, I prayed every night that the Lord would do what was best for our family. And I said, "You betrayed me."
I noticed she did not pray for you to win.
This wasn't about that. This was about power and moving up and so forth. So I came back, licked my wounds, and when I thought about getting back in it, there was really an opportunity, I thought, a couple of years after that to run for mayor and win. But it was one of those things where I by then probably got my $50,000 paid off. I wasn't going to go raise the money. People who'd helped, wasn't in my heart. And so I, rolled my note and paid it off and did what I needed to do. And I realized then that, I could have gotten back in, but it was, a politician's life's hard, and there are a lot of risk involved. And also, it's not necessarily good for your family either. I've known a lot of lousy children who were sired by politicians. And I think it's hard to keep it all together. When you think about what ifs, I've thought somewhat about Governor Kemp. He put it all on the line to run, and I admire him for it. He was not the favored candidate. The lieutenant governor was running.
Right.
He did it anyway, and had he lost, he would have probably been more broke than I was. But he won, and so that's the reward. And I've counseled others. You've got to, if you're going to be a successful politician over time, you got to be willing to have a politician's life and take those chances. Had I been independently wealthy, I'd have been back in it 30 minutes later. But I wasn't, and right. Not that I came up poor or anything else, but there was no, we never had any trust funds in our family. And so, my opportunities I could give my own children, my family, myself were on my shoulders, and that's what I chose to do.
Right. Well, zooming out a little bit, I want to get your thoughts on these changes in Georgia politics that you lived through and have witnessed. Why do you think the Democratic Party of Georgia was able to hold on to power so long here in the state as opposed to some of its neighbors in Alabama, South Carolina, Mississippi, places like that?
Well, you had Carl Sanders you had Ernie Vanderbilt was a progressive governor. He got caught because he was there when they integrated the university, and he had to do the political stuff, and he never really recovered from that. On No Not One, black was going to enter the university. And same things with the schools, and he had to face those decisions. But there was a progressive movement that then got Sanders elected that stumbled when the backlash that got Maddox in. But then in the 70s, you had a series of also very moderate, good governors. I mean, in my view, Busby, was business oriented.
Mm-hmm.
Joe Frank Harris stayed the course. Zell Miller, of course, was very progressive looking forward. So you had those people as Democrats leading it. And then in 1968, after Julian Bond, when Maddox was governor, and at that time the governor was the Democratic Party, he led a delegation to the Democratic Convention, and Julian Bond led a rump delegation and created a lot of bad publicity and so forth. And you had the group we talked about before, who were Democratic office holders who became Republicans, mm-hmm. I think thinking that Herman Talmadge might defect with them. He didn't. And so they all went down to defeat, except for Phil Campbell, who became the Undersecretary of Agriculture. So that put a damper on it for a while. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you didn't want to look at Jimmy Bentley and Alpha Fowler and those people, Jack Ray, who made that leap and got cut off, and then do it again if you're a Democratic office holder, because you saw their fate.
Right.
But ultimately then, by the time the 1990s came along, and I thought there was a chance when Gore and Clinton were elected president and vice president that there was a way to turn the South back to the Democratic Party. Mm-hmm. The Democratic Leadership Council, or whatever they call it, that was the moderate Democrats
right,
and so
right.
on. Well, Clinton then led off with gays in the military. That was kind of one of the first issues. And then everybody perceived them as bowing to the more liberal elements in the party. So that in 8 years, Al Gore couldn't carry Arkansas or Tennessee.
Or Georgia, for that
Or
matter.
Georgia. And he hanging chads down in Florida. It was, and so the tide was rolling that way, and I don't know that I necessarily blame Al Gore and Clinton. They lived in their times as well, but that was kind of the last hurrah. And after that, during the 90s to early 2000s, it all shifted.
Why do you think or how were the Republicans able to consolidate power in the state so quickly? Sonny Perdue wins in 2002.
Right.
A couple defections, Jack Hill and others swing the Senate. 2 years later,
right.
The House. How and now every row office, constitutional officer is a Republican. How were those Republicans able to do it so quickly after years of either futility or near misses?
Well, if there was a very popular book about business a few years ago called Good to Great. And the whole theory of these companies that had grown was they kept doing the right things over and over and over until then they do it long enough that then it explodes. And I think that's kind of what happened to the Republicans. There was also, underlying that current, whether many Republicans have been in it, there's a racial element to it. African Americans became a majority of the Democratic Party, a majority of the representatives and senators and so forth. If you're in a rural county, you mentioned Jack Hill, he couldn't have kept winning. And in our own case, as I mentioned, Tom Coleman's probably the most powerful politician in our county. In '92, you'd gone through redistricting. It was going to be harder for him. Eric Johnson was flirting with running against him, and I think Coleman, who had a good business and so forth and done things, and of course he later went back as highway commissioner, but I think he saw the handwriting on the wall, and it was probably kind of what Sam Nunn went through. He could have been elected, but it would have been so painful, and it would have been maybe for one more term, so why do you do it?
Right.
And at that time, I think everybody presumed that I would run and so forth, but by then it had won. I still wasn't quite financially recovered from my lieutenant governor's race, and you could feel it. That district had been, which I lived in, had been redistricted. It was more Republican than it had been, and I may have been able to win or may not, and I wasn't willing to go through that because you just had that feeling it was about to shift. And of course, then when it did, it was the dominoes falling.
Right. Right.
And when the rural legislators figured out they couldn't be Democrats anymore and survive, then one by one they changed. One of the funny things that I thought was real clever I used to do, when my friends would get beat, who had been in the house with me, I would call them up in the early 90s and I would say, well, I'm sending you a check for $100. I know you probably need it after the race was over. And I'm going to give you some good news and some bad news. Or the bad news. The bad news is you lost, I'm sorry. The good news is you're going to make twice as much money next year as you have ever made practicing law. And I'd call them up about a year later and they would say, you were right. Because if you're in one of those jobs, particularly as a lawyer where time is money, you're spending, I used to figure it was a third of my time politicking. Well, your overhead's the same. And so when you get down to the net, sure enough, after recovering, you can live a more financially rewarding life. Politics was not good to me when I was in office because of those things. But after I was out of office, it was very good to me in just knowing a lot of people and trying to handle things competently for clients and using the contacts you had to build a law practice back.
How do you think the Republican majority compares to the Democratic days in terms of policy priorities and how they've managed the state and prioritized certain things?
I think as a state party, they've been very responsible. I mean, I think Purdue, Deal, and Kemp have been good governors. Certainly for business. Now, I'm not putting a party line perspective on that. They've been awful governors on a lot of social issues, but there's been a lot of, I've always thought it, there's been a lot of talk lately, well, when was it Trump who did it? And I lay it at the feet of Newt Gingrich in a way back in the 90s with Clinton, when, you know, he was willing to shut down the government and do all those things. And all of a sudden we're in warring enemy camps, and it's remained that way now. And so that's been the thing that's hamstrung it. But fortunately, within our state government, it hasn't been that strident. Now, again, the big issues that I mentioned first, the abortion, the gun control, other things, you just got to be on one side or the other, depending on which party you're in. And that is the unfortunate thing in modern politics, and gerrymandering has accelerated that.
Now, you mentioned, obviously Governor Perdue, towards the end of his second term, obviously was the Great Recession. So there's, the numbers are skewed and everything like that. But with Governor Deal and then Governor Kemp, and how, by any measure, Georgia economically has really been on the up and up. Reference our conversation about the ports and the developments. Is there a concern of yours, as a former legislator, that at some point the pro-business policies and these the push for social issues are going to start to negatively affect growth or the future economic prospects? Or is that something that is just a mountain out of a molehill?
No, I'm not sure that the two are necessarily opposing forces. To me, the thing that is the opposing force is, and if I were in office right now, I wouldn't call it an underclass, but you've got an underclass of whites and blacks in this state who because of educational and opportunities and other things are not able to participate fully in the growth that you're talking about. And that's sort of the unfortunate part.
Right.
And then get back to the race issue, you've got the situation in, I mean, Atlanta may be your prime example right now with what's going on internally with regard to the operations of that city, and I don't pretend to know the details, but I do know a lot of people are trying to get out of Atlanta who can, because perceived crime problems and whatever, tax problems, whatever else, and that's not good. That's not healthy. And when the legislature's sitting talking about incorporating Buckhead out of an existing city, we've created now these little cities up North Fulton County, the White Flight. So we're able to avoid each other instead of having to work together. And that's the unfortunate trend that's happened, and where it all ends, I don't know. But we're going to continue to have those dynamic forces. But right now, they're all kind of allied. Everybody thinks growth's good, there are folks in Colorado who don't think all growth is good, or in California who don't think all growth is good. But in Georgia, so far, growth's good.
So far.
So far.
Well, back to the political, party politics. Why do you think it took so long for the Democratic Party of Georgia to start mounting credible challenges to Republicans, and even and when I started this project, we couldn't point to Democratic statewide office holders.
Yeah.
That has obviously changed. Why do you think it took so long, and why do you think it happened when it did?
Well, I think Stacey Abrams had a lot to do with it in the shift. When I realized I probably could not get back into politics because whatever I was selling or believed in nobody was buying or going to buy, is when Jason Carter and Michelle Nunn ran.
So 2014.
In 2014. And those are stellar names in Georgia politics, and they couldn't win. Mm-hmm. And because you were tied, in large part, they were tied to the Democratic Party and the perception of liberalism that it brings, in national politics. And then when you've got people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and others who are so prominent within the Republican Party, and then you've got
Democratic Party,
excuse me. And then everybody, we elect a, quote, more moderate president in Biden than they are. But when you peel back the policies, it is so, they are very liberal. I mean, what he's doing is on that agenda. He's following that agenda. Mm-hmm. That I don't think you can rekindle a Democratic Party that has more moderate views on those things in Georgia. Now, Stacey Abrams was a phenomenon to me. She got further than any of us ever thought because she decided, from what I read in press reports, that she wasn't going to worry about trying to get folks who were in the middle. She was going to go run to a base. Mm-hmm. and do it that way, and she did, and got within 55,000 votes of winning, which everybody was stunned with, I think, probably her. The only people who were probably more surprised is when were Roy Barnes and Governor Perdue, the morning Perdue got elected, because everybody was surprised. But be that as it may, I think people were surprised by that, and then the national media latched on to that, and of course, they've convinced everybody that Georgia's a purple state or something now, and
You don't sound convinced.
I'm not convinced. Georgia's a conservative state, and the more you take and cater only to an African American base, the numbers aren't going to get you above 50% consistently. And that's proved in the last election, I think, with Stacey Abrams. Thought she could come back and do that. And of course, all of the national politicians and the national news media bought into that uh, and promoted it as it was something could really happen. But in my bones, I never thought it could happen with her. I was surprised she got as close as she did the first time. I was not surprised that she lost by a substantial majority trying it for a second time.
Okay, so in 2022, yeah, I think it was something like 7% that Governor Kemp won, and that was pretty. That margin was pretty uniform across the constitutional offices as well, which, I think objectively that was probably the best slate of candidates the Democrats had put up in a number of years.
Sure.
Absolutely. The exception to that, of course, or the exceptions were President Biden in 2020,
Right.
and Senator Warnock in
Right.
2020, and a runoff in 2022,
Yeah.
and a runoff. Why are those two the exceptions? Why were they able to win statewide as opposed to the others?
Well, in 2020, in my mind, Donald Trump elected Ossoff and
Senator Warnock.
Senator Warnock, and he shifted it when he went up Northwest Georgia and had that big rally. The night he was having that rally, there were billboards out on 75 telling his people not to vote, or not necessarily his people directly, but you got all these people, whether it's all rigged and it's no good and you don't need to vote and so on and so forth. I guess because they thought they could just take over anyway, as we're learning more about through the January 6th committee. But it was a fluke in a way, and then Warnock could, I think, could have been defeated this time. He's lucked out on his opponents and what's happened on the other side of that equation. And then we'll see if Ossoff can run that same train of luck, in what would be 2026.
Yeah, 2026.
But it's going to be close. It's going to be competitive and so forth. But unless the Democratic Party can show itself to be more moderate, I don't think Georgia's going to shift that way. I don't see it. It's again, unless and the demographics have helped, and so forth. But and then of course, the thing that the Republicans did, which I thought was stupid, is they never really appealed to the Hispanic community, and now the Hispanics, I guess, have become a force enough in their own that, at least according to national news reports, a lot of Hispanics, certainly Cuban refugees and others, are supporting the Republicans, and so they're not in play anymore. And there is so much emphasis now on, or when you read stuff, I mean, it's this thing that DeSantis has done down in Florida, where yesterday you've got Al Sharpton and everybody there demonstrating in front of the Florida Capitol on censorship and not teaching AP courses that include slavery, and then you've got all these misrepresentations being made on either side. It's going to further divide, going to make a deeper racial divide than there has been in Florida, and if that bleeds over here and here as well. Are you going to stick with your tribe?
Do you think that, and obviously there's no way for knowing for sure, at least with the two people in this room, but do you think that is a calculated decision on Governor DeSantis's part and others who are for the AP African American history issue, the critical race theory issue? Is that calculated? And if so, what's the end game?
Well, it's absolutely calculated. Al Sharpton, I thought it was funny last night, was calling DeSantis Little Trump, and or Trump Jr. and Little Trump and so forth, and he's doing what his daddy would have done and all that kind of stuff, deriding him. I mean, they watched Trump do it with a base, and so they're trying to latch onto that same base and differentiate themselves as they can, and you know it's you know it my personal view is I never thought the Republic was as fragile as it is before January 6th, and if you have Trump return to office, it's going to be very fragile. And that's the worst outcome. All these people jumping in may just help Trump, or that's what all the political pundits seem to think, because the base will stick with him. He's going to get 20%, whatever it is, and then depending on what's going on the other side. I do think this, while I'm pontificating without qualifications,
Right.
I think if there is a reasonable Republican candidate who runs against Joe Biden, that reasonable Republican candidate will win. Biden's 80 years old. They're going to hammer him on it. Kamala Harris has not emerged as what folks thought she would be. The perception of her is not good. Biden's showing a lot of energy, but ultimately you take Nikki Haley was trying to hit it yesterday when she made her announcement, talking about generational changes and the new leadership for the 60s is what John Kennedy ran on.
Yeah, historically, Kennedy, Clinton, Obama, generationally that
people get tired.
Yeah, and you know, it's it'll be really interesting, because obviously if we were having this conversation in 2015, I don't think a lot of folks would have given Donald Trump much of a chance and just how he and his candidacy and his presidency has upended, national politics and Georgia politics.
Sure.
When you were in office, the suburbs were ruby red, and that was the driving force for the realignment in the state. Whereas, I think there's probably a lot of good political science papers to look at the voters in Georgia who split their vote between Brian Kemp and Raphael Warnock.
Well, yeah. And I wasn't buying off on people in Georgia know how to split their ticket, and they've done it in the past, and they'll do it in the future. When you've got a candidate who can only appeal to a base, and that's on either side. Mm-hmm. So we'll all live to see whether we're right or wrong on these prognostications.
That is the blessing and curse.
If anybody ever watches this tape, 10 years from now, they're going to say, "Those fools, they didn't know."
Right. Well, that's the when you play the game, you're right sometimes, you're wrong sometimes. Well, Jim, thank you so much. I've taken up enough of your morning and into your early afternoon. But
well, thank you.
On behalf of the Russell Library, thank you for this. Thank you for your support with the Russell Foundation. And thank you for your friendship, sir.
Well, I appreciate it.
I do appreciate it.